How often do you find yourself torn between fishing dry flies or tossing nymphs, especially if you pull up to the river and there's not a whole lot going on? Will the fish still rise to eat a big dry fly, or are they chilling on the bottom waiting for your prince nymph? Well, you don't have to choose. You can have both. The dry dropper rig is a way to fish a dry fly and a nymph at the same time, and it is one of the most effective ways to catch trout anywhere. This week on Untangled, I'll walk you through how to set up a dry dropper, some of the favorite flies I've got for them, and why this is my most used and most effective rig. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. I fish a dry dropper rig almost all the time, unless it is middle of winter and I'm nymphing or I'm chucking some streamers. It's almost a certainty that I've got some flavor of dry dropper rig tied onto the end of my line. They're just fantastically effective for trout in a river. I'll even throw them for bass in a river, and then they work really well on lakes too. It's just a very versatile rig that's effective in so many different situations. And today, obviously, I'm going to spill the beans on why I love this rig so much, how to get it all set up, and a few of the little tips and tricks for it. But before we get into that, I just want to remind you all of what we've got coming up in the Q&A section of the show this week, because we're going to talk about something else that I think every angler runs into, at least at some point in their career, and that is, how long do you spend sitting and fishing one hole before you move on? Do you just sit there and throw cast after cast and try and annoy the fish into eating, or is there a more effective way to cover the water and to know when it's time to move on to the next piece of river? We're going to talk about that in the Q&A section of the show, so make sure you stay tuned for it. You don't want to miss it. But back to the dry dropper, which is what we're talking about for the open of the show here. First thing I'm going to do is define the rig for those who don't know what it is. And then I'll walk you through how I set it up. And then we'll talk about why it's so effective, some of the pros and cons to this rig, and then the flies that I like to pick for setting this up myself. So a dry dropper, very, very simple. It's just a way to fish two flies at once. It accomplishes that goal of giving you a dry fly up top, but then there's some sort of nymph hanging below it. Again, it's a really simple rig. I think it's simpler than a standard nymph rig because you don't have a strike indicator, you don't have split shot to deal with. You just have a dry fly, a nymph, and one piece of tippet connecting the two flies. And it's a really simple, easy thing to rig up. And speaking of rigs, I know that remembering all these knots and putting rigs together can be pretty frustrating, especially if you're a beginner or you just don't get out as often as you like. You're trying to do the knot and you can't remember and your fingers don't work right. It's all very frustrating. And so that's why we've actually put together a rigs and knots pocket guide. It's got all this information in it for you, so you don't have to remember it. You can just save this guide and use it when you're out on the river. It has everything you need to know about setting up a dry dropper rig, as well as a bunch of different nymph rigs and some dry fly rigs as well. So if you want a copy of this, I will throw a link to it in the show notes, or there's a link right here on the screen for those watching the video podcast, if you'd like to snag that. And also for those watching the video podcast, you're going to get a little sneak peek because the graphic that's popping up on the screen right now is the kind of graphic you'll see in that rigs and knots guide. This is my preferred way of setting up the dry dropper. There's a few different ways to rig this up, but the way that I prefer to do it is the easiest, I think, and it's also the most effective. So what I do is I start out with my dry fly tied onto the end of my leader. I just use a standard clinch knot for that. Unless I specify something different, I'm using a clinch knot for everything because it's just a very effective, simple, easy knot. I've never had any issues with it. I don't use the improved clinch. I just use the regular old clinch knot, and it works extremely well. I'm a big fan of just keeping it simple. So clinch knots all around, unless I tell you that I'm using something different. So dry flies onto the end of the leader with a clinch knot. and then I will tie the tippet for my dropper nymph off the bend of that dry fly hook. And then I put my nymph onto that tippet, and boom, that rig is put together. You're done. You're ready to hit the water, catch some fish, impress your friends, and finally get a fishing pick that gets attention on some of them dating apps. Because I know there's a glut of those on there from my time when I was on those. Oh, thank goodness I'm not anymore. But anyways, like I said, it's a very simple rig to put together. And I base my dropper length off of the depth of the river. So ideally, I want that nymph to be in the bottom third of the water column. So I want it riding a little bit above the bottom. That means my dropper is usually about 18 to 24 inches long, give or take. But I'll fish droppers up to 3 feet long in some cases, or as short as like 6 inches in other cases. If the fish are suspended and they are eating nymphs, I'll have a short dropper. If they're eating nymphs right below the surface, they're eating little emergers right there, I'll go ahead and drop that nymph very short. But if I'm fishing big pockets with deep water and I just want to get down, I want to get down to the bottom, I'll drop that nymph as deep as I need to. That's when you'll see a 2 or 3 foot dropper on the end of my rigs. You want to match this rig to what you're fishing, but I have found that you can rely on 18 inches as a pretty good starting point for a dropper length, at least on the small streams that I fish out here in the West. So if you're on water similar to what we have in the Rockies, then an 18-inch dropper is probably a pretty good place to start. You can go a little shorter, a little longer. 18 is a good starting point. When you've got that longer dropper on, it's great because you can get down to the bottom of those pools and pockets, but they're a lot harder to cast because you've got to wait a little bit longer for your fly line and that whole rig to straighten out during your casting stroke. It's the same principle as when you've got a long, deep nymph rig on. They're harder to cast. They're more prone to tangles, but you're getting down to where those fish are. So if that's a trade-off you're willing to make, then it's worth it. Now, speaking of setting this rig up, some folks like to tie the dropper in this rig off the eye of the dry fly hook. So you would tie your dry fly onto the end of your leader, and then you would take a piece of tippet and go through the eye of that hook, through the eye of the dry fly hook, and that's where your tippet would be attached instead of off the bend. I don't like that rig. Personally, I think that it messes with how the dry fly lands in the water and how it drifts because you've got the weight of that nymph pulling it down head first, and that's not really how flies drift on the water. When it's coming off the bend of the hook, I've found that it helps the fly lay just a bit more flat and look a bit more realistic on the water. So that's why I do it that way. But this is a good time. You know, I might get some heat for that opinion. So this is a good time to remind you all that I'm not here to tell you how to fish. I'm telling you, here's this rig, here's how to put it together, here's different ways to put it together, here's what I prefer. I'm just giving you all this knowledge so that you can do what you need to put flies in front of fish and make them look real, because that's your job, okay? So all this information I'm giving you, you can apply it however you want. It is completely up to you, and there is no wrong way to apply this information. It's only wrong if you're not catching fish, and then in that case, you make some tweaks and figure it out, start catching some fish. So if you like to rig up your dry dropper with the tippet, with that dropper coming off the eye of the dry fly hook, be my guest. I think that if that works great for you, that's fantastic. But I'm telling you again, this is what I want to do. This is how I rig it up, and this is why I do it this way. So don't think that I'm telling you this is how you have to do it, and if you don't do it this way, you're an idiot or you're not going to catch fish. It's not what I'm saying at all. And that goes for all the advice you get from this show. These are the foundational principles. This is what we're trying to accomplish. This dry dropper rig, we are accomplishing a dry fly up top. We're getting a nymph into another part of the water column. We are covering multiple parts of the water column at once. We're being very effective with how we fish. That's the principle behind it. That is what we're trying to do. How you choose to apply it, that's completely up to you. All right, now that I'm off my soapbox, the last part of the rigs that I want to touch on here is one that I've heard a lot about from listeners and viewers of the show, and that's the adjustable dry dropper rig. It's basically just a way to set this rig up so that you can adjust the depth of that nymph as you move from spot to spot on the water, because you know that it's very rare you're going to have two sections of the river be the exact same depth all day long. And one of the cons to the dry dropper rig is you don't have the adjustability you do with a nymph rig. You can't dial in the depth perfectly for every piece of water that you're hitting. So this adjustable dry dropper rig seems like a good idea. And again, this does tie back into the whole soapbox moment of I'm just giving you the foundational knowledge and you do with it what you will. But I've gone out and used this adjustable dry dropper rig. Wasn't that big of a fan of it. But before I did this show, I said, you know what? I'm going to give it another shot because I want to give folks my honest opinion on it, my honest experience with it, and give them information to make their own decisions. So I went out just a couple of days ago, rigged this up, the adjustable dry dropper rig. What you do is you tie your dry fly onto a piece of tippet with a perfection loop on the end of it. And then that loops onto your leader and it can slide up and down, and you can put stopper knots in your leader with triple surgeons knots or whatnot to tweak the depth and to keep the dry flies and the nymphs a certain distance away from each other. And anyway, so I go out, I'm on the water, and I get into this. It was actually an incredible dray catch. One of the best dray catches I've ever fished in my life. And the entire time I had this adjustable dry dropper rig on, I did not catch a single fish on that rig at all. The fish weren't being terribly picky, but I couldn't get a decent drift with this rig. I couldn't get it to cast right. I couldn't get it to land where I wanted to. I was having a lot of tangles. My dry fly kept wrapping around the leader. The presentation was very sloppy. I gave it a good solid go for 45 minutes, maybe an hour or so. And then I finally said, all right, let's do a little test. Let's bust out our scientist hat here. Do a little A/B testing. So I tied on my regular dry dropper rig, just like I would normally do it for that situation. And within the next 3 hours, I caught 20 fish, fished the rest of that hatch, and had just an amazing time on the water. Part of that, I will admit, is the confidence factor, because you will always fish better with rigs and flies that you believe in. I know that personally, when I fish a new fly or a rig that I've never used before, and if I don't think it's going to fish well, someone's like, oh, you got to try this, Durant. And I try it and I'm like, I don't know. I fish it very hesitantly. If I'm not convinced it's going to work, I'm a little hesitant with it. I'm not as quick and confident and sure in my hook sets or my casts or even my drifts. I'm just kind of like, I don't really know. I'm still trying to feel it out before I hit full send on it. So when you give me a rig that I do feel confident in, though, it's completely the opposite. Okay, if I know that'll fish well, then I'm going to fish well as a result. So that was probably part of it. I wasn't comfortable with this rig. I wasn't a fan of how it was working out. But I did try to go into this objectively, okay? Because I got to the river, and as I was rigging that adjustable dry dropper rig up, I remember thinking to myself, man, this is going to be good. I actually might start using this because I like the idea of being able to slide it around. But it just didn't perform well for me, at least as well as my usual rig. And again, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from trying this rig. I'm not trying to crap on it because I know it works well for some people, but there's a lot of tags and knots that you've got to manage with this. I think it's a lot harder to set up, especially for a beginner, and a lot harder to cast. So for that reason, I recommend just the standard dry dropper rig, tie them off the bend of the hook. It's a much simpler, much easier way to set it up, and I think it's every bit as effective as the adjustable rig itself. So that's your rig. That's how to set it up. And again, if you would like some help remembering all this, we have that rigs and knots pocket guide that you can download that has all the info in it. And then we've also got a video on setting this entire rig up as well. I'll link that for everyone in case you're interested. But now we've got to talk about why this rig is so effective. Why do I believe in the dry dropper so much? Why am I proselytizing for the gospel of the dry dropper rig? Well, it's really simple. It lets me target 2 areas of the water column at once. So if the fish are interested in eating off the top, then I have a dry fly up there and I'm giving them an opportunity to eat it. And since I love dry fly fishing so much, I love to watch them eat off the top. It really scratches that itch for me. But flip side of this is I'm also a realist. I understand that about 80% of a fish's diet, especially trout, is subsurface. They're eating nymphs. They're eating all the bugs that are underwater because it's easier. It's a lot less energy for them to do that than to eat a dry fly. So I'm going to seriously up my chances of catching fish if I've got a nymph on as well. So that dry dropper, it gets me my dry fly itch. I get that scratched, but then I really feel confident I'm going to catch fish with that nymph on there as well. It's also very effective to use during a hatch. And that's why it's my go-to rig from about right now, midsummer, through early fall, because this is the time of year when we just have boatloads of bugs hatching. Our caddis, our mayflies, our stoneflies are all popping. You're even getting midge hatches still. And you've got 2 or 3 different species of mayflies and stoneflies coming off, depending on where you live. There's just a lot of bug activity going on. So the fish are looking up. They're not huddled on the bottom waiting for the nymph to come by. They're looking up. They know there's a lot of food out there. But fish that are in one spot in the river might be eating just the adults. And then in another spot, they might be wanting the nymph or the emerger. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about there, all your aquatic insects go through a life cycle where they start out as a nymph. They start out as the underwater version of the bug. And then they become an emerger, which is the transition between the baby and the adult. And then they hatch into the adult that's up on top of the surface with its wings, that's flying around, ready to mate and lay eggs and then go back to the river and die. So the dry dropper rig lets me give fish more of what they want. It lets me target 2 stages of the hatch at once. I can also mix and match my bugs. I can put a caddis up top, and then a zebra midge or a mayfly nymph underneath it if I want to. If I've got a midge hatch and a caddis hatch happening at the same time, boom, I can cover both of those and very quickly see what the fish are eating. And then if you pull up to the river in middle of the day, when the hatches tend to be at their weakest, usually the best part of the hatch is early morning and early evening, or late evening, pardon me. You do get some good midday hatches, but a lot of times that's your prime time. So you show up to the river, there's really not a whole lot going on. The fish are still going to take a nymph at that point as they wait for the evening hatch to really kick into gear. So in that case, your dry fly is acting like a strike indicator for your nymph, and the dry fly is the best strike indicator you can get. They're super sensitive. They don't hit the water too hard, and they've got a natural silhouette, unlike your big foam strike indicators that are big round balls that land on the water. You will find instances where that can put the fish down, where they will, you plop a big bobber in the middle of it and they just kind of all like, oh yeah, hey, that's Johnny trying to bob fish for us again. We're not falling for that this time. They'll get that kind of attitude with it. Okay. But let me go a little bit deeper on a couple of these points here. Let me add some context so you understand what I was just talking about. A couple of days ago, when I was trying out the adjustable dry dropper rig during that drake hatch, I rolled up to the river, got out of the truck, walked down to this little bridge just to see what the fish were doing, see if I could see any fish rising. And I saw fish rising. I saw fish jumping clean out of the water. So I ran back to the truck, grabbed the rod, ran back to the river. And when I got down to the water, there were a whole bunch of caddis buzzing around in the bushes, which I expect they're going to be in the bushes this time of year. That's what they're doing. But there were also some mayflies gliding over the top of the water. There were even a few salmon flies, which are just a giant stonefly, that were chilling on a lot of the boulders, and a few other little bugs mixed in with that I wasn't quite sure if they were just another small mayfly or a midge or what all was going on. But I also wasn't entirely sure what the fish were eating because there were so many bugs coming off all at once. I did see one fish eat a mayfly. I saw another couple of fish flashing right under the surface, which told me they were eating emergers. So that could have been an emerging mayfly or an emerging caddis. And then on top of that, when you have stoneflies out and you see the adults crawling on the rocks, the fish are going to key in on that. It's very rare to see the adult stoneflies and not catch a whole bunch of fish on stonefly imitations of some sort. So I've got all these different options and I'm not sure which one to fish. So my rig was a big size 12 parachute Adams to imitate the drakes. And then I put a size 16 caddis emerger on underneath that. And then I put a size 12 Frenchie on below that. I was fishing a dry dropper. 3 flies are legal to do in Wyoming. It's my understanding that 3-fly rigs are not legal everywhere. So check your local regulations before you tie on 3 rigs or 3 flies. And just to expand on the 3 flies thing a little bit, there's a little bit of controversy around them. I wrote a magazine article years ago before Ventures where I talked about my dry dropper rig. And I got this novel of an email from a fella who wrote in to tell me that I was no better than a bait tosser and that I might as well just chuck treble hooks with worms and kill every fish I catch if I was going to fish with 3 flies like that. He got very indignant about it. It was kind of like John Goodman, Brother, Where Art Thou? Just very indignant and just in my face. Luckily, he wasn't trying to sell me a Bible, though, so I guess we got that going for us. But anyways, there is a little bit of grief about it. I think it's an effective way, especially when you have so many different bugs coming off. It's an effective way to just go through the list and see what the fish are eating. Because once you get a few fish on the flies, you can make some solid observations, not a guess anymore. You can say, okay, they're eating these drakes, and then you can go down to a single dry fly or just a dry dropper, or you can keep your dry dropper on. It's just another way to cover more of the water and be more effective, especially when you've got big hatches like this going on. And that's what happened with that rig. I had a few fish eat the Frenchie. None of them ate the caddis emerger, and then a whole bunch were just crushing the Adams. So that told me they were keyed in on those drakes. There were all those other bugs coming off, but those fish, for whatever reason, wanted the drakes. So I ended up just cutting off all the nymphs and fished that big Adams for the rest of the day, and that's what I caught all my fish on. So that dry dropper rig really lets you dial in on what the fish want, and it helps you do it very quickly. You might hear about fly patterns that are designed to be searching or prospecting flies, which are designed to help you figure out where the fish are and what they want to eat when they're not actively rising or doing a whole lot. You can throw those onto the dry dropper rig and really be effective. Just again, you're covering so much of the water. You're being very effective with your casts, and then those prospecting flies can help you figure out where the fish are, what they might be wanting to eat. Now, for all its virtues, because it has tons of them, trust me, I could go on for a lot longer about all the virtues of the dry dropper rig, but it ain't perfect. You're casting 2 flies, or 3 if you use the dry dropper, and that's a recipe for tangles. So you are going to run into some issues there, especially if you're off with the timing on your cast or you're still learning casting. And just make you guys feel better. All right, just between me and you. I know some folks consider me an expert because I have a podcast. Okay, that's a ludicrous statement in and of itself, but I'm just as mortal as everybody else. I don't say that to sound arrogant. Okay, the day with this drake hatch, I tangled that adjustable dry dropper rig like a million times, and then when I switched over to my regular dry dropper rig, I tangled that a whole bunch. I kept slapping the water like a kid hitting things with a pool noodle. There was no delicacy with my presentation. It did not look that great. I kind of had to I had to force myself to slow down. I had to pay attention to my cast. It happens. Sometimes you get too excited, or sometimes your mechanics just break down. So if you are getting tangles, don't let that dissuade you from using it, okay? Because it happens to all of us. That's the whole point of sharing this stories. It happens to all of us. So don't let the tangles dissuade you from using the dry dropper rig. Because the really the big knock against it, the one reason I can really say when people are like, I don't like to fish that way, and I ask them why, and they say, well, I can't adjust my depth. So, all right, that is a very legitimate concern, because you are stuck fishing your flies at a certain depth. If you get to a really shallow section of the river and shallow riffles and the fish are hanging in them, but your dropper's too long, you're going to hang up on every single cast. You might not catch very many fish. So then you've got to cut and re-rig, and folks don't like to cut and re-rig because it cuts into the fishing time. And then if you get into a deep section of the river too, you might not be deep enough to get to where those fish are. My only pushback on this would be it's relatively easy to just add a little bit of length to your droppers. You can blood knot on a little bit more tippet. And it's very easy to just cut it off and shorten it up that way. So the more you do that, the more you tie knots and set up rigs, the quicker you're going to get at it, to the point where making little adjustments here and there doesn't seem as daunting as you want. But when you set this dry dropper rig up, and you've got that dropper dialed in to that bottom third of the water column, that's the reason I say you don't want it at the very bottom, because the fish aren't on the very bottom all the time right now. They are looking up. But if you're in that bottom third, you're still down low enough to get to those fish, but you're also not hanging up on the bottom in that spot. So you've got a little bit of wiggle room with that rig. I very rarely have to do a wholesale change in depth on my dry dropper rigs throughout the day, because I go to just get those flies in that bottom third of the water column. And that gives me a decent amount of flexibility to where I don't have to tweak it constantly. So if that's a worry, again, it's legitimate, but there's workarounds for it. And I wouldn't let that prevent me from using the dry dropper rig, because again, it is just crazy effective. Now, as far as what flies to use with this rig, this is a lot simpler than folks make it out to be. There's not a certain fly that, oh, you have to use this with a dry dropper rig, or you have to use this. Ask yourself, what's your job as a fly angler? It's to put flies in front of a fish and make them look real. So it doesn't matter how you rig those flies up. The only thing that matters is that they are a match for where and when you're fishing. Okay. That's it. That is as simple as it needs to be. So during summer, right now, my rig usually has some sort of mayfly or caddis up top, either some kind of Adams, an elk hair caddis, and I'm fishing those pretty large in sizes 12 and 14. Then my nymphs are going to be a mix of whatever else I think might be active right then. If I get to the river and I see the drakes and the stoneflies and the caddis all hatching at once, then I'll mix and match. I'll put a caddis up top with a stonefly nymph on the bottom, or vice versa, because again, I want to see what the fish are eating. If you get to the river and there's not a whole lot of active bug life, or you see only caddis or only mayflies, then you can stick with just a caddis rig or just a mayfly rig. So that would be like an Adams up top with a Frenchie underneath it, or a caddis up top with a caddis pupa underneath it. It really is that simple. The trick is to pick flies that are sized correctly, because you want your dry fly to be able to support the weight of that dropper nymph. So if I want to fish a big stonefly nymph, because I see a bunch of big stoneflies coming off and I'm excited to get into them, then I will need a big foam bug to support that big, heavy nymph. If your dry fly is consistently sinking, it's likely because your nymph is too heavy. So you either need to up the dry fly or you need to downsize the nymph. But the rule of thumb to use here is you want your dry fly one size bigger than your nymph. So if you pick a size 12 nymph, you want about a size 10 dry fly just to make sure that it's staying up. And the last thing I'll note here on this is some folks get really worried about using barbless hooks on the dry dropper rig or just in a multi-fly rig at all. In fact, good buddy of mine, Hiram Weaver, and I, we were out fishing a couple of weeks ago, and we had this discussion where he's like, yeah, I will only tie my rigs up with barbed hooks. I pinch the barbs, but I want the barbed hooks because I've had droppers slide off of those hooks. I don't have my droppers slide off my barbless hooks all that often. For me, it's not something that's happened enough to make me say I'm never fishing a barbless hook ever again. It's just very rare that it happens. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you get a regular hook, you crimp the barb down like we recommend, just it makes hooking and unhooking the fish a lot easier. That little nub that's left after you crimp the barb down will be enough to stop that dropper from sliding off the bend of your hook. So that is the dry dropper rig. I know that was a lot of information. So if you learned anything new or you've got some more questions about the dry dropper rig, drop a comment and let me know so I can help you out, or we can just talk more shop about this rig. But we are going to head into the Q&A section of the show, which is where I answer questions directly from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there's a link to send those in. You can find that in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Our first question this week comes to us from Jonathan from Washington, writes in and says, how long do you take at one spot before moving on? Just started fly fishing last month and have been getting skunked every single time. There's probably other issues, but one is definitely I think I am not moving around enough, fishing the same hole for 30 to 45 minutes. Great question, Jonathan. What you've got to do, and anybody else who has this question of how long do I fish a hole before I move on, might want to take some notes for a minute. This is the process here, okay? You've got to first get yourself a star chart. Then you're going to plot your location where you're fishing on that star chart. Then you've also got to plot your position of where you were when you were born, okay? And then you're going to need to pick a point somewhere else in between those that will form a right triangle. Then you're going to need to find the cosine of that triangle, and that number is the amount of milliseconds that you are going to spend on that spot before you move on. Okay, it really feels that complex sometimes, though, doesn't it? Like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to do this. How long do I spend before I move on? It's a lot simpler. There's no math involved, none of that garbage. Okay, it is actually very simple. I've said this a lot in the show lately, but your goal as a fly angler is very simple. It is to put flies in front of fish and make them look real. Okay. So what that means is that you've picked a couple of flies that you feel are a reasonable match for what is in and on or around the water at that point in time. You've identified a spot where the fish are likely to hang out. And then you've made casts through that water that you feel confident in. That means those casts saw your flies getting to the right depth if you're nymphing. Okay, and if you're nymphing, that means usually getting into that bottom third of the water column. So if you're fishing a river that's 5 feet deep, you get your flies within about 12 to 15 inches of the bottom. Or even closer in some instances, but at least 12 to 15 inches from the bottom. For dry flies, it's obviously not about depth, and it's a lot more about whether or not you've got those dry flies in the feeding lane. Did you land those dry flies exactly where the fish were rising, or were your casts off a foot to the left or a foot to the right? Excuse me. Sometimes fish will move that far to eat flies, and they won't really care too much, but vast majority of the time, the fish, when they're rising consistently in a hatch, they're not going to move too far side to side to eat the fly. You've really got to put it right on, not just in their kitchen, but sometimes you got to put it right on their dinner plate, okay? So if you've done all that and you feel confident that your nymphs got to where they needed to be, or your dries got to where they needed to be, or your dry dropper rig covered both in one cast, and you haven't caught anything from that spot, that's when it's probably time to go ahead and move on. Now, you could be a lot like Alex, who is much more patient and willing to work a hole than I am. I'll throw 2, 3, 4 casts in a hole, and then I'll usually bounce, because if there's fish in the spot where you're fishing and they're willing to eat, they'll usually eat the first few good drifts that go past them. And then if not, the chances of them eating are not great in my experience. Okay. I'll just tip my hat to those fish and move on. When I don't do that, when I sit in one hole and I just spend hours there and I put drift after drift after drift in front of the fish, it feels like I'm not even fishing anymore. And I'm just harassing the trout until they finally just eat to get me to go away. It's really not my preferred way to fish. And I'm not saying anything bad about folks who fish differently. Because again, Alex fishes differently, and then his dad fishes a lot more different than both of us. He is the kind of angler who wants to explore every nook and cranny of the hole, and he really wants to just work all the water slowly and methodically, and he enjoys the heck out of it. And again, that goes back to what I said earlier in the show, right? Where I'm not telling you what to do. I'm giving you the foundational knowledge, and you apply that as these situations arise. So Alex's dad, he loves fishing this way, where he really methodically works the water. And he will catch fish out of holes that Alex and I have already fished that we're like, there's nothing in there. He'll sit there and work it until he does catch the fish out of them. So what it comes down to really is personal preference, because I'm probably, if there's a spectrum here, and you got the left who really quickly work through the water, and you've got the right who very slowly work through the water. I'm probably a little bit further to the left. Alex is probably right in the middle, and then his dad is a little bit further to the right. Okay. Personal preference is what it comes down to, because of the three of us, we actually all got to go fishing, and Alex's other brother, Berkeley, we all got to go fishing a couple weeks ago together, and we all fished differently. Berkeley went like 5 miles upstream and fished streamers back downstream to the truck all day. Alex and I fished dry dropper rigs, kind of hopped each other up and down the river. And then his dad fished behind us and really worked the water. We all enjoyed the heck out of ourselves. We all caught fish, and we all did it the way that we wanted to. And that's kind of the whole point of learning all these different techniques and tactics, is so that you can fish the way you want to, the way that you find to be most enjoyable and most effective for you. Okay. So really the point is that it is up to you how long you want to spend on a piece of water. I would recommend for a beginner, that once you've put, let's say, a dozen really good drifts through the hole, that you move on, you find fish that are a little bit more willing to eat. Okay. Because especially as a beginner, getting that positive feedback of fish eating your fly is very important. Now, the flip side of that, that's my advice. I say move on, keep covering water. Flip side of that, you could be a little bit more like Alex and his dad. Alex and I were talking about this morning, actually, before I sat down to do the show. He says that him and his dad were kind of reinforced to fish a little bit slower, because that's when they would get the fish, is when they really worked and really dialed in and explored every nook and cranny of the hole. And that's what's effective for them. So they will just default to spending more time there. Again, nothing wrong with doing it that way. You just got to find the balance of what works for you. I think if you're spending a lot of time on one hole and you're not catching anything out of it, especially as a beginner, I would err a little bit towards just covering water, figuring out where the fish are, catching them. And then once you're like, okay, I know I can catch fish here, then to my mind, it's makes a little bit more sense to slow down and really work stuff, because then at least you know that you're doing things right. You know that your flies are where they need to be, that you're using the right flies, that your drifts are good, all that other stuff that could be preventing you from catching fish, that's dialed in. So that's the only reason I would err on going and exploring a little bit more, is get a little bit more feedback on your rig so if you've got it all set up correctly. But hopefully that helps. I appreciate the question. Thanks for sending it in. Tom from Colorado has got our next question, writes in and says, "Hi, fairly new to fly fishing, but picking it up quick thanks to you and your content. Thank you. My question is, if I want to set up a nymph-only rig, is it as simple as using your standard nylon 9 or 7.5 foot 4 or 3X leader and then building off that with fluorocarbon tippet? Or do I need to use a fluorocarbon leader? My hope is to keep my leader inventory consistent, to be able to use the same nylon leaders I use for everything else and just clip the tippet end off, add a tippet ring, and then add some fluorocarbon tippet onto that. Am I off base here? Thanks." Tom, thanks for your question, but I don't answer questions about nymphs anymore. I hate to break it to you guys. I'm boycotting nymphs, actually. I've decided that you are not really fly fishing unless you are fishing dry flies or a dry dropper rig. A full nymph rig's just blasphemy, and at that point, I just go throw bait. Okay, obviously I'm kidding, completely kidding, but I saw someone make that very argument the other day in a forum somewhere, and it kind of blew my mind, and then I remembered it when I was reading your question. So, seriously, making this claim that the only way to fly fish is with dry flies, and if you don't dry fly fish, then don't even bother picking up a fly rod. And I just shook my head. That's not the attitude we need in this sport. That's obviously not the attitude we have here at VFC at all. Okay. So let me actually answer your question here. Nymph rigs can be that simple. You're not off base in how you're thinking. And it really does not matter if you're using nylon or fluorocarbon to build out that nymph rig. Now, for those who don't know, you've got two different kinds of fishing line out there. You've got nylon, which is the most common one. Then you've got fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon has got a coating on it or not a coating on it, pardon me. Some of them do have a coating, but fluorocarbon is just designed to be a little bit more invisible in the water. It's a little bit denser than nylon, so it sinks quicker. And then it's got higher wet knot strength, so your knots are going to hold up better when they get wet. Nylon, it floats. It's got a little bit of stretch to it, so it's not very brittle. Fluorocarbon can be pretty brittle sometimes, so you can snap things a little bit more with fluorocarbon. But nylon's got a little bit of stretch to it, but it's nowhere near as abrasion resistant. And then again, it's a little bit more visible in the water than fluorocarbon is. So there's a lot of debate about, well, you've got to use fluoro for nymphing all the time, and you've got to use nylon only for dry flies. And if you're on the Henry's Fork or the Railroad Ranch section and you're fishing to those fish that are probably the pickiest trout on the planet, then yes, I would say it probably matters at that point. But for the vast majority of trout fishing, it doesn't friggin' matter. Okay, don't worry about it. Fluoro is a great thing to use for nymphing. I use it when I have it, but if I don't have fluoro, I don't fret about it. I don't let it ruin my day. All of the leaders that I use are nylon because A, it's cheaper and it floats better than fluorocarbon. So for me, I like it better for my dry fly rigs. So when I set up my nymph rigs, I will just tie my first nymph to the end of my leader of whatever I've got on there. And then I'll use fluorocarbon to tie the dropper for my second nymph. And then if I'm doing a third nymph, I'll tie that with fluoro as well. If I don't have fluoro with me, again, I'll just use nylon. Everything will be fine. The world will keep spinning. We don't have to worry about that. So you absolutely don't need to worry about fluorocarbon only for your nymph rigs. If you've got a rod and reel that you only ever nymph with, it might be worth rigging it all up just with fluorocarbon. But if you want more versatility, I think nylon's the way to go, in my opinion. If we're really going to split hairs, I'm saying it doesn't matter. But if you're insistent on saying, okay, well, I want to have these leaders all set up, I think nylon's a little bit more versatile than fluorocarbon. But again, that's just my opinion. So you can really do with that what you will. Now, as far as adding the tippet ring at the end of it and then using that to build off your nymph leaders, you can definitely do it. It's a very effective way to do that. I know folks who do it. I personally don't use tippet rings. They're just little metal rings that you can tie droppers off of. I just blood knot the tippet that I need onto the end of my leader for whatever instances I'm doing. If I need to size it down, if I need to add length, I just use a blood knot, tie that tippet on, and then keep going. Okay. So like if I want a nymph and I've got a size 16 nymph as my first nymph in my rig, but my leader is too thick, then I'll just blood knot on some tippet, use that to start my rig, and then you'll build off from there. But again, a tippet ring is going to work just fine. You're not off base at all. Your rig sounds like it's going to work fine. If that's what you've decided makes the most sense for you, then go ahead and do it. And yeah, you're not off base at all. And for those who'd like to see how we put together all our nymph rigs, we actually have a video about rigging up for nymphing. I'll link that in the show notes if you're interested, or here on the screen for those watching the video podcast. But thank you so much for sending that question on in. Barrett from the US has our next question, writes in and says, my largest rod is a 9'5" weight, and I can't seem to cast size 8 or 10 streamers more than 15 feet. Do I have a rod or line weight issue? A leader size issue? I've used up to 4x leaders. Am I using too much tippet? Do I just need smaller streamers to cast them like my other flies? Barrett, good question. Does not sound like you have a rod or a line weight issue. And I say that because I've got a good friend who can chuck like a size 4 streamer on a 4 weight 90 feet. I don't recommend doing that. It's not the most pleasant way to fish a giant streamer, but it can be done. What you're dealing with here, it sounds to me like a timing issue with your casting. And then you probably do have a leader issue as well. We'll get into that. So let's talk about the timing for a minute. The reason that anglers fail to get distance on their cast is that they're rushing the cast. That is the number one problem I see when I teach beginners. When I guided back in the day, I catered towards beginners, and I would, I'd always have to tell folks to slow your cast down because folks are always out there cracking it like they're Indiana Jones. You got to slow it down just a little bit, okay? Because as you cast, you have to let your fly line unfurl completely in front of and behind you. The line has to straighten out. Once that line straightens out, that is when you start your next casting stroke. That means that as you get more line out to add distance to cast further, you have to wait longer and longer in between casting strokes. Okay? It also means that your fly rod will stop moving. The fly rod has to stop moving during the cast. Your fly line always moves. Your fly rod has to stop during the cast. It needs to come to an abrupt stop so that it will transfer the energy to your fly line. If your rod is constantly moving during the cast, you will never get distance on that cast. You have to let the rod stop during the casting process. So that's probably one of your bigger issues is that you're not letting the rod stop. Again, and not being there, not being able to see your cast. I can't say for sure, but this is just my best guess. So focus on those casting mechanics. Make sure that you are you're letting the line straighten out, that your rod's stopping, that your movements are smooth and purposeful. And then we've also got to look at the leader issue too, because when you're throwing those bigger, heavier flies, it can be really tough to turn those over if you're using a leader that's too light for them, because the leader needs to have enough mass to turn over that larger fly. Otherwise, it's just going to kind of wimp out and not cast very effectively at all. That's why you've really got to make sure that you're using leader that is sized to your fly. And the best way to do this is to take the size of the fly and divide that by 3, and that'll give you a rough idea of what size of leader or tippet to use. So for your size 8 streamer, in your example, divide that by the hook size by 3, you get 2.6. So you could use either 2X or 3X leader. That's going to have enough mass to turn over that fly. But with streamers, I generally just use a short level section of like 8 or 10 pound test because I've found that helps turn those over better during the casting process. The tapered leaders really kind of get in the way of streamers, I've found. So I would even consider just give yourself a 5-foot chunk of like 8 pound test and cast with that and focus on those casting mechanics. And I think that's all going to come together for you. So I appreciate you sending that question in. And with that, folks, don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures from folks out there in the VFC audience who are living real life. We love to hear your stories and to see the pictures come in. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you'd like to share with us, please go ahead and send those in. There's links to do that in the show notes or right here on the screen if you are watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Justin. Writes in and says, growing up, my dad taught me so many things. Love for the outdoors, hunting, work ethic, and everything in between. A few years ago, I started fly fishing more and more. Well, now it's my turn to teach him something in return. My favorite thing in the world, fly fishing. Here he is catching a nice-sized tiger trout here in Utah. Justin, that's really stinking cool. It's cool you got that relationship with your dad and that you're able to go out and teach him and show him how to have the same kind of fun that we're all having with fly fishing. So that's really cool. I appreciate you sending that in the picture. And I guess it's a good reminder too. If you ain't fished with your dad lately, go out and do it. So I appreciate it, Justin. With that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for being here with us. If you haven't already, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, which is the whole goal of what we do here at VFC. We want you to get out on the water and enjoy yourselves. And until next week, that's what you ought to do. Get out on the water, enjoy yourselves, and live real life.